Henry Michael Walker was born in the summer of 1967 in a small town outside Phoenix, Arizona, where the desert heat bent the horizon into mirages and the sky stretched endlessly like a canvas of faded blue. His father, Robert Walker, worked the land with calloused hands that knew every inch of soil, every root that refused to give, every season that promised abundance or drought. His mother, Eleanor, kept the house with the quiet strength of women who understand that survival in the desert requires more than water, it requires will. Henry grew up watching his father rise before dawn, watching the sun climb over the Superstition Mountains, watching the land yield its reluctant gifts to those who respected its ancient rhythms. He learned early that the earth does not forgive carelessness, that water is more precious than gold, that a man's word is the only currency that matters when the banks are 100 miles away and your neighbor's fence line is the only law you can see. The Walker family farm sat on 240 acres of land that Robert's grandfather had claimed in the early 1900s, back when Arizona was still a territory finding its identity between the violence of frontier justice and the promise of statehood. The property deed hung in a frame in the living room, yellowed with age but clear in its declaration of ownership. Henry's childhood was shaped by the geometry of that land, the straight lines of irrigation ditches his father dug by hand, the precise rows of alfalfa and cotton that turned the desert floor into a patchwork of green and white, the boundary markers his grandfather had placed with ceremony and reverence. This was not just property, this was identity. This was the accumulation of 3 generations of backbreaking labor, of loans repaid penny by penny, of droughts endured and floods survived. The land held the sweat of his ancestors, and Henry understood from the time he could walk that he was its custodian, not its master. He attended the local high school, where he played defensive end on a football team that rarely won but always fought until the final whistle. Teachers remembered him as quiet but observant, the kind of student who sat in the back row and absorbed everything without feeling the need to prove his comprehension. He graduated in 1985 with decent grades and no particular ambitions beyond continuing the work his father had started. There was no romance in this decision, no poetic calling to the land. It was simply what made sense. His hands fit the tools, his body understood the rhythm of planting and harvest, his mind calculated water tables and soil composition with an intuition that seemed bred into his DNA. He married a woman named Sarah Kimball in 1989, a school teacher from Tucson who had come to Phoenix for a conference and stayed for a man whose silence felt like safety in a world that talked too much. They had 2 children, a daughter named Rebecca born in 1991 and a son named Thomas born in 1994. The family lived in the farmhouse that Robert had built in 1955, a modest structure of wood and stone that stayed cool in summer and held heat in winter, where the front porch faced east to catch the sunrise and the back door opened onto fields that seemed to stretch all the way to eternity. The rhythm of their lives followed the seasons. Spring meant preparing the soil, checking irrigation systems, calculating seed costs against projected yields. Summer meant vigilance, watching for pests, monitoring water levels, walking the fields at dawn and dusk to catch problems before they became catastrophes. Fall meant harvest, those weeks of exhausting labor when every hand was needed and sleep became a luxury measured in stolen hours. Winter meant maintenance, repair, planning for the next cycle. Henry worked alongside his father until Robert's death in 2003, a quiet passing in his sleep that felt appropriate for a man who had lived without drama or complaint. The funeral was attended by neighbors who understood that words were inadequate, who brought casseroles and stayed silent, who shook Henry's hand and looked him in the eye and communicated everything that needed to be said. Eleanor moved to live with her sister in Flagstaff, unable to remain in a house that echoed with absence. Henry became the sole proprietor of the Walker farm at the age of 36, carrying forward a legacy that now rested entirely on his shoulders. Phoenix was growing. The city that had once been a distant cluster of lights on the southern horizon was spreading like water spilled on hot stone, subdivisions blooming where desert had stretched undisturbed for millennia. Real estate developers discovered that desert land was cheap and that people from California and the Midwest would pay premium prices for houses with Spanish tile roofs and backyard pools shaped like kidneys. The value of agricultural land began to climb as speculators realized that today's cotton field could become tomorrow's luxury housing development. Henry received phone calls from men with smooth voices who spoke in terms of fair market value and retirement security, who painted pictures of financial freedom and a life without the tyranny of weather and commodity prices. He listened politely and declined. The land was not for sale. It had never been for sale. It would never be for sale. These men did not understand. They saw acres and dollar signs. Henry saw his grandfather's hands in the soil. They saw development potential. Henry saw his father's grave in the family plot near the northwest corner. They saw profit margins. Henry saw his children's inheritance, the physical manifestation of continuity and belonging. The trouble began in the spring of 2000. Henry noticed tire tracks near the eastern boundary of his property, deep ruts that suggested a heavy vehicle had driven across land that should have been untouched. He followed the tracks and found evidence that someone had been surveying the area, wooden stakes driven into the ground, orange tape tied to scrub brush, the unmistakable signs of boundaries being marked. He pulled up the stakes and threw them in the bed of his truck. The next week they reappeared. He pulled them up again. They reappeared again. This pattern continued for months, a silent argument conducted through wooden markers and tire tracks. Henry drove to the county assessor's office in downtown Phoenix, where a clerk with tired eyes and coffee breath pulled up the records on his property. Everything was in order. The deed was clear. The taxes were paid. There were no liens, no disputes, no legal claims of any kind. Henry asked about the surveys. The clerk shrugged. Sometimes developers conduct exploratory surveys on land they hope to acquire. Sometimes boundary disputes arise from old maps that don't align with GPS coordinates. Sometimes people make mistakes. Henry drove home unsatisfied, knowing that these stakes were not mistakes. In the fall of 2008, as the national economy collapsed and banks failed, and retirement accounts evaporated, strangers began appearing on Henry's land. They came in pickup trucks and SUVs, parking near the eastern edge where the property bordered state trust land. They walked the perimeter. They took photographs. They made phone calls on cell phones, speaking in voices too low for Henry to hear. When he approached them, they were polite but evasive. They claimed to be studying soil composition. They claimed to be surveying for the county. They claimed to be lost and looking for a way back to the main highway. Henry told them they were trespassing. They apologized and left. They returned the next week. Henry called the county sheriff's office and was told that an officer would be dispatched when one became available. No officer ever came. He called again. He was told that trespassing is a civil matter unless there is immediate danger or destruction of property. He was advised to post no trespassing signs and consider hiring a lawyer. Henry posted signs. The strangers ignored them. By the winter of 2009, the situation had escalated. Henry discovered that someone had cut his fence in 3 locations, creating gaps wide enough for vehicles to pass through. He repaired the fence. It was cut again. He installed a lock on the gate that led from the main road to his property. The lock was removed with bolt cutters and left hanging from the chain like a taunt. He began spending nights in his truck, parked near the eastern boundary, watching for intruders. He saw headlights in the distance, vehicles that moved slowly along paths that should not exist. When he drove toward them, they disappeared into the darkness. Sarah began to worry. The farm demanded full attention during the day, and sleepless nights spent on surveillance were taking their toll. Henry's face developed the gaunt appearance of exhaustion. His temper, usually as steady as his father's, began to fray. Rebecca and Thomas noticed the change in their father, the way his jaw tightened when anyone mentioned the eastern fields, the way his eyes tracked movement beyond the windows. In February 2010, Henry found a construction trailer parked on his property, a small office on wheels that had been towed onto his land and positioned near the survey stakes. Inside the trailer were blueprints showing a planned residential development called Desert Vista Estates, 240 acres divided into half-acre lots, each containing a 3,000-square-foot home with a swimming pool and 3-car garage. Henry recognized his property on the plans. His farmhouse was marked for demolition. His fields were designated for grading and infrastructure. His family's cemetery plot was scheduled to become the community dog park. He drove to the address listed on the construction company's sign, a office park in Scottsdale, where a receptionist with perfect nails and a practiced smile told him that he would need to schedule an appointment to speak with anyone regarding property development. Henry did not schedule an appointment. He returned to his farm, hooked a chain to the construction trailer, and dragged it off his property with his tractor. The trailer landed in the ditch along the public road. Within hours, he received a phone call from a man who identified himself as Richard Castellano, president of Castellano Development Corporation. Castellano's voice was calm, but carried an edge like a knife wrapped in velvet. He informed Henry that the trailer was private property and that removing it constituted theft. Henry informed Castellano that the trailer had been placed on his private property without permission and that he would remove anything and anyone that trespassed. Castellano chuckled, a sound without humor. He told Henry that these matters were better resolved through cooperation than confrontation. He offered to purchase the Walker farm for what he described as a generous price. Henry hung up. The police arrived the next morning. 2 officers in uniforms that seemed too clean for the desert dust stepped out of their patrol car and asked Henry about the construction trailer. Henry showed them the property deed, the survey maps, the no trespassing sign. The officers were sympathetic, but explained that this was a civil matter between private parties and that they could not intervene without a court order. They suggested Henry hire an attorney. Henry explained that attorneys cost money he did not have, and that the legal system moves slowly while trespassers move fast. The officers shrugged. They had responded to the complaint. They had documented the situation. They had fulfilled their obligation. They drove away, leaving Henry standing in his driveway with a piece of paper that felt increasingly meaningless in his hand. Pause and reflect when justice stops at the gates. Who dares to cross? Throughout the spring of 2010, the invasion of Henry's property became systematic and organized. Surveyors arrived with theodolites and GPS units, treating his land as though it were unowned desert waiting to be measured and divided. Construction workers appeared with bulldozers and graders, beginning the process of cutting roads where Henry's irrigation ditches had run for decades. When Henry confronted them, they showed him work orders from Castellano Development Corporation. They were just doing their jobs. They had families to feed. They didn't know anything about ownership disputes. Henry called the sheriff's office repeatedly. He filed formal complaints. He drove to the county courthouse and spoke with clerks who typed his statements into computers and promised that someone would look into the matter. No one looked into the matter. Henry hired a lawyer, a young woman fresh out of law school, who worked from a strip mall office and charged rates Henry could barely afford. She filed injunctions and restraining orders. The court scheduled hearings. The hearings were postponed. The legal process ground forward with the speed of continental drift, while Castellano's machines tore up the earth at the pace of modern industry. The police increased their presence around the development site and Castellano's office. They assigned detectives to shadow key figures in the project. They interviewed Henry Walker multiple times, asking about his whereabouts during each incident. Henry provided alibis that were impossible to verify, but equally impossible to disprove. He had been home. He had been working in his fields. He had been alone. Sarah and the children were still in Tucson, removed from the situation. Henry's lawyer advised him not to speak with police without her present. Henry complied. The detectives noted his calm demeanor, his lack of visible anger or agitation, his careful responses that revealed nothing. They suspected him. They could not prove anything. The investigation continued to generate paperwork while producing no arrests. Frank Morrison, the loan officer who had offered Henry predatory mortgage terms, was a 38-year-old banker who specialized in agricultural lending. Morrison understood that farmers in financial distress were vulnerable targets for loans, with terms that appeared generous but contained clauses designed to accelerate default. His portfolio included several farms that had transitioned to foreclosure. Their land then sold to developers at prices far exceeding the outstanding loan balances. Morrison earned bonuses based on the profitability of his loan portfolio. Foreclosures were profitable. Morrison was very good at his job. In late June, Morrison failed to arrive at work. His colleagues tried calling his cell phone without success. His wife reported him missing that evening. Police found his car in the parking lot of a Phoenix bank branch. Morrison was found the next morning in an empty lot 3 blocks away, in an area scheduled for commercial development. He had been confronted sometime during the night. The encounter had been decisive and final. The note left with him read, "You weaponized debt. Every foreclosure bears your signature." The handwriting was consistent with previous messages. The pattern was now undeniable. Someone was systematically confronting everyone who had played a role in the destruction of the Walker farm. Thomas married in 2021 a woman named Jennifer who taught mathematics at the same high school where Sarah worked. The wedding was small and private, held on the farm with family and a few close friends. Henry walked his son to the spot where the ceremony would take place, a patch of ground on the eastern 40 acres, land that had been destroyed and reclaimed, land that represented both the worst and best of what the Walker family had endured. The minister spoke about building futures on foundations of the past, about honoring what came before while creating something new. Henry stood beside Sarah and watched his son promise forever to someone, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel something approaching peace. Rebecca came home for the wedding. She had not visited in 3 years, maintaining her relationship with the family through phone calls and video chats, but keeping physical distance from the farm and everything it represented. Walking the property again, seeing how the land had healed, watching her father move through the fields with his familiar deliberate grace, it softened something in her that had been hard for too long. The night before the wedding, she found her father alone on the back porch, staring out at the darkened fields. She sat beside him in silence for several minutes before speaking. "I never asked because I didn't want to know, and I still don't want to know, but I need you to understand that whatever happened, whatever you did or didn't do, I love you, not despite it, not because of it, just because you're my father, and that matters more than anything else." Henry turned to look at his daughter, and in the dim porch light, she saw his eyes were wet. He did not cry, he did not speak. He simply nodded, acknowledging her words and the gift they represented, the gift of love without judgment, acceptance without understanding, connection despite the terrible possibilities that stood between them. Rebecca stood and kissed the top of his head, the way he had kissed hers when she was a child, and then she went inside, leaving him alone with the darkness and the land and whatever memories or regrets he carried. Pause and reflect. When the cost of justice equals the price of the soul, who calculates the balance? After the funeral, Henry stood beside his mother's grave. She had been buried next to Robert in the family plot on the farm, as she had requested. The plot now contained 4 generations of Walkers, from Henry's great-grandparents, who had first claimed the land, to his parents, who had nurtured it through the 20th century's challenges. Henry understood that he would eventually join them here, his body returning to the soil he had worked for 60 years. The thought brought comfort rather than fear. This land held everyone who had loved it. It would hold him too, and after him, it would hold Thomas, and Thomas's children, if they chose to continue the work. The land would outlast them all, indifferent to human drama, but shaped by human labor, a witness to everything that had been done in its defense. Thomas and Jennifer's first child was born in the spring of 2025, a daughter they named Eleanor after her great-grandmother. Henry held his granddaughter in the same kitchen where he had once planned what might have been murder or might have been justice, and he felt the weight of continuity settle over him like a benediction. This child would grow up on this land, She would learn its rhythms and requirements. She would inherit not just property, but responsibility, not just acres but identity. What Henry had done or not done to preserve this inheritance, that burden was his to carry alone. The child would be spared that knowledge, would grow up with stories of her great-grandfather's strength, rather than speculation about his violence. The mythology continued to evolve. In 2025, a popular podcast called Desert Justice re-examined the case, interviewing law enforcement officials, journalists, and legal experts. The consensus among most participants was that Henry Walker had almost certainly been responsible for the confrontations that led to 6 deaths, but that proving it beyond reasonable doubt would be impossible given the careful nature of the crimes and the passage of time. The podcast's final episode posed a question to listeners: if Henry was guilty, did justice require his prosecution, or had the exposure of corruption and the preservation of his family's farm constituted a fair balance? The poll results were split almost evenly, revealing that society remained deeply divided about where justice ends and revenge begins, about whether institutional failure excuses individual violence, about what we owe to victims and what we owe to a system that failed to protect them. Henry never listened to the podcast. He had no interest in how others interpreted his story or judged his actions. He woke each morning before dawn, made coffee, and walked his fields in the quiet hours before the desert heat became oppressive. He checked irrigation lines and examined crops and planned for seasons ahead. He worked until his body demanded rest, then sat on his porch and watched the sun set over land that bore his family's name and his family's sweat and possibly his family's sins. He had made his choices. He had paid his prices. He had kept what mattered most. Whether that constituted victory or defeat was not for him to decide. The Walker farm stands today, as it has stood for more than a century, a modest rectangle of cultivated land, surrounded by desert that constantly threatens to reclaim what has been taken from it. Tourists driving past on Highway 87 see nothing special, just another farm in a state that is rapidly urbanizing, another anachronism resisting the inevitable transformation of agriculture into housing developments and shopping centers. They do not know the history of this particular plot of ground. They do not know about the corruption that nearly consumed it or the violence that might have saved it. They see fields and irrigation ditches and a simple farmhouse, and they keep driving toward Phoenix or Payson or wherever their GPS guides them. But the community knows. The people who live here and work here and raise their families here, they remember. They tell the story to their children, who will tell it to their children, each retelling, adding, or subtracting details until the truth becomes indistinguishable from legend. Henry Walker becomes larger than life in these stories, transformed from a flesh and blood farmer into a symbol of resistance against institutional corruption, a reminder that ordinary people sometimes do extraordinary things when pushed beyond endurance, a warning that justice denied eventually becomes justice taken. Henry himself remains small and particular, a specific human being with specific strengths and specific flaws, working specific land through specific seasons. He is 78 years old now, his body worn by decades of labor, his face weathered by sun and wind, and whatever secrets he carries. He moves more slowly than he once did. He requires help with tasks that he used to complete alone, but he still rises before dawn. He still checks the fields. He still performs the rituals of stewardship that his grandfather and father performed before him. This continuity is his answer to every question, his response to every accusation, his justification for everything that was or was not done. On the wall of the farmhouse, next to the yellowed property deed that has hung there for more than a century, there is now a photograph of Eleanor Walker holding baby Eleanor, great-grandmother and great-grandfather and great-granddaughter, separated by 90 years, but connected by the land they both claim as home. Henry stops sometimes to look at this photograph, seeing in it the whole sweep of his family's history compressed into a single moment. His mother's weathered hands, supporting new life, his granddaughter's unfocused eyes, seeing the world for the first time, the kitchen table visible in the background, where so many family meals were shared, and so many difficult decisions were made, everything that has been preserved, and everything that was sacrificed to preserve it, contained in one image. Thomas finds his father standing before the photograph one evening as the sun sets, and the shadows grow long across the kitchen floor. He joins him in silence, 2 generations of Walker men, contemplating the weight of inheritance. Finally, Thomas speaks, "Whatever you did or didn't do, I want you to know that I understand, maybe not the specifics, but the why of it, and I want you to know that I would have done the same. Maybe that makes me as bad as you might be, or maybe it just makes me human. Either way, this land survives because of you. The family survives because of you. That's what I'll tell my daughter when she's old enough to ask questions." Henry nods slowly, acknowledging his son's words. He does not confirm or deny anything. He simply places his hand on Thomas's shoulder, a gesture that communicates everything that cannot be said aloud: gratitude and regret, love and burden, the terrible knowledge that protection sometimes requires destruction, that preservation sometimes demands sacrifice, that good people sometimes do bad things for good reasons, and must live with the consequences forever. The desert night settles over the Walker farm, bringing its merciful coolness after the day's heat. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote calls to its pack, a sound as old as the land itself. The irrigation system hums its electric rhythm, delivering water to rows of crops that will feed people the Walker family will never meet. The wind carries the scent of disturbed earth and growing things, the perpetual smell of agriculture that marks this small rectangle of land as different from the wild desert surrounding it. Henry stands on his porch, as he has stood on thousands of nights before, and watches over what he has kept. The notebook with the names is long gone, burned in a barrel behind the barn on a night when Sarah took the children to visit her parents, and Henry had hours alone with his thoughts and his matches. The ashes were scattered across the eastern 40 acres, mixing with the soil that had been destroyed and reclaimed, becoming part of the land itself. If those names still exist anywhere, they exist in memory alone, unwritten and unspoken, carried by one man who will take them to a grave in the family plot where his parents and grandparents wait. Justice, Henry learned, is not a destination but a conversation, an ongoing argument between what should be and what is, between the rules we create and the situations where those rules fail, between the people who believe in systems and the people who fall through their cracks. He does not know if he won that argument. He knows only that his family survived, that his land endured, that the corruption was exposed and stopped. Whether that constitutes justice or merely revenge, whether he is hero or monster, or something more complicated than either label allows, these questions will outlive him, debated by people who will never face the choices he faced, judged by standards that assume the existence of good options where sometimes only terrible ones exist. The wind shifts, carrying the scent of rain from the mountains to the north. The crops will benefit from rain. The soil will drink deeply. The land will continue its patient work of transforming water and sunlight into sustenance. Henry breathes in the promise of that rain, and allows himself a small smile. Tomorrow he will wake before dawn. He will make coffee. He will walk his fields. He will do the work that needs doing. This is his penance and his purpose, his punishment and his pride. This is all he has ever been, and all he will ever be. A farmer who fought to keep his land, and who paid whatever price that fight demanded, and who will answer for it when the time comes before a judge whose authority extends beyond property lines and legal systems, and the complicated moral territory where humans make choices that haunt them forever.
The story of Henry Walker and the Arizona land justice confrontations remains unresolved, because some stories resist resolution. They exist in the space between confirmed facts and suspected truths, between legal verdict and moral judgment, between what we can prove and what we believe. The 6 men died, the corruption was exposed, the Walker farm survived. These are facts. Everything else is interpretation, shaped by the values and experiences of whoever tells the tale. Henry Walker is a murderer who escaped justice. Henry Walker is a victim who finally fought back. Henry Walker is a complicated man who made impossible choices in an impossible situation. All of these statements might be true. None of them can be proven. The uncertainty is what makes the story endure, what transforms a land dispute in Arizona into a parable about justice and desperation, and the things people do when pushed beyond the limits of endurance. In the end, the land itself is the only witness whose testimony might be trusted, and the land keeps its secrets. It holds the sweat of 3 generations of Walkers. It holds the ashes of a notebook with 7 names. It holds the memory of bulldozers and blood, of corruption and consequences, of systems that failed, and individuals who responded to that failure in ways that will be argued about for generations. The land grows crops and feeds families, and continues its patient work regardless of human drama. It will outlast everyone involved in this story. It will outlast the arguments about this story. It will remain silent and fertile, waiting for whoever comes next to tend it and protect it, and make their own impossible choices about what they are willing to do to keep it. Henry Walker walks his fields in the gathering darkness, and somewhere beneath the stars that have witnessed everything, his story continues.